I'm joined today by Heina Dadabhoy, who's a former Muslim and current atheist who writes about Islam, gender, sexuality, and politics. Hina, your background is fascinating and your story is fascinating. And I think a good place to start is to sort of set for the audience the sort of religious context in which you were brought up as a child. Let's start there.
Well, my parents were immigrants. I was born and raised right here in Southern California, where I still currently am. Growing up, my family wasn't incredibly religious. They followed the basic rules like praying and fasting and not eating pork, but nobody really covered themselves, and missed prayers were not that big of a deal. But about the time I was 5 years old, maybe a little bit younger than that, my mother met a religious teacher around here and became much more religious. And my father very soon followed suit. This is not uncommon. Just in the 90s, in immigrant communities among Muslims, it was very common for a lot of immigrants, especially after having children, to sort of search for their roots and try to go back to something that they thought was more familiar because they were freaked out by what they saw in American society as sort of moral decadence and degeneration. So it was very common for people like that to turn to religion as a source of solace and comfort and stability. And my parents were no exception. And so they ended up actually moving us to London for a year, where I received what I would call basically kind of an extremist Islamic education, not necessarily violent or anything like that, but definitely very conservative, very literal and things like that. And so when I came back to the U.S., because we couldn't, the job opportunities for my father didn't pan out in the U.K. By the time I came back to the U.S., I was very religious, very devout. At the age of 7 or 8, I started wearing a headscarf of my own accord. I had read most of the religious books my mother had brought home that were intended for adults, really not for children. But I took it very seriously. I thought, if I'm going to be a Muslim, I'm going to be a Muslim. There's no point in trying to be anybody or anything else than what I was told I was supposed to be. And I would, in fact, correct my own parents on their practice of religion. I would correct my aunts and uncles and cousins. And it wasn't out of a sense of self-righteousness or superiority. I just thought that they needed help because I did things when I was a kid that I later found out weren't allowed in Islam out of ignorance. And so I assumed that I needed to help my family to dodge hell. That's not how they took it. Many of them turned away from me. Many of them made fun of me and things like that. And I couldn't understand. I couldn't get my head around the idea that someone would be a Muslim and believe in heaven and hell and yet do all kinds of mundane sins with complete impunity. But so I was a really fun kid. That's the sarcastic bottom line.
And you've talked
But
about when you first experienced doubt about your Muslim faith, and you talk about the
mhm.
story when you're 11 years old and your sister is involved in a carnival accident of all things. Tell me about that
Mhm.
story.
Well, that was my first big doubt. No, my sister was 10. I was probably about 12. But she was involved. She was brutally mangled in a carnival ride accident on mosque property of all places. So, the mosque had some fundraiser carnival. They had some rides. They weren't doing a really good job about checking heights and weights and things like that. And so my little sister rides this ride and is brutally mangled, head to toe bleeding, taken to the trauma center, not even the ER. They didn't know what to do with her. And after they wheeled her into the MRI, the doctor came back with the results and said, thankfully there's no brain damage because she had a gash on her head. So we were worried that her brain had been damaged. And my parents immediately started crying and thanking Allah that her brain was okay. And I had this moment thinking, why didn't Allah just not let her have the accident? Especially since, we tried our best to obey him and we were at a mosque carnival of all things trying to raise money in the name of Allah. And then, that was our reward. But I immediately put those doubts away because I thought, I'm just a human being. I don't know anything. God knows the best. Allah knows why this happened. And, in the years after that, myself and my parents did a lot of work to try and get some kind of lesson or meaning to try and make what happened to her feel meaningful. But ultimately, it was a terrible thing that happened.
And I'm curious if you have any insight now. Some people who would consider themselves in the same way that you describe, religiously devout, they might have that question of why didn't God prevent this bad thing from happening in the first place? And they would, in a really serious and honest and sincere way, say, God works in mysterious ways. There's a plan for everybody, period, and truly internalize that. For you, that didn't make sense, it sounds like, although you were able to sort of push that aside. What do you think now, looking back, was the sort of difference maker? In other words, why were you asking those questions and not satisfied with the answer, God works in mysterious ways, there's a plan for everyone, whereas someone else might have been satisfied with that answer?
I feel like part of it is I took my faith very seriously and I always wanted to know the answers and I always wanted to be as religious as possible. I feel like a lot of people who are religious, I'm not saying they're bad people for doing this, but they only go to a certain point with their examination and their viewing of religion. They're satisfied with, we don't know. I don't know as an answer, or, you know, and even I sort of, and I guess part of it too is for them, religion is more of a comforting thing. For me, religion was never comforting. It was always a thing that pushed me. It was always a thing that on some level upset me because I knew that so many people, including myself, would probably go to hell at least for a little while. So I never derived comfort or solace from religion for the most part. It was always a driving factor for me. It was always something that was, more than comfort. It was who I was. It was the way I approached the world. It wasn't just some nice words that I heard once a week or something like that. And so I feel like for the God works in mysterious ways, which is more of a Christian thing, I think that works, if you're the sort of person who religion only comes into your life at births and deaths and weddings and on Sundays or something like that.
So you continued moving away from Islam, particularly when you started university, you started learning philosophy and about existentialism, etc. What was the sort of, or let me phrase it a different way. Was there a specific point at which you said, I am no longer Muslim?
There was. It was a very slow and gradual letting go of religion. I wouldn't say I moved away from Islam after that, though. After the Carnival ride accident, I moved closer towards it, especially after 9/11. So I actually got more and more religious because I felt like this was part of my identity and I wanted to understand it better and I wanted to be able to explain to non-Muslims what exactly this religion that I was a part of was about. But yeah, inside there was a lot of turmoil. The more I learned about Islam, the less I agreed with it. But I kept pushing and kept trying. But I did have a moment where I admitted that I was no longer a Muslim, and that was not long after I asked myself the question: if I had not been born into a Muslim family, would I have converted to Islam? So, say I had been born into a Christian family, Jewish family, or agnostic family, whatever, and I had come across Islam as a non-participant, would I have found it so compelling that I would have converted to it? And the answer was no, I wouldn't have.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on an issue that's becoming increasingly prevalent and noticeable in terms of discussions of Islam. There is, on the one hand, the need to be able to criticize certain practices or particular expressions or ideas of Islam. And at the same time, I think it's really important to acknowledge that anti-Muslim bigotry is real. It exists in the United States, and that's an issue that we have to deal with. And I find in most of my conversations with extremists or people on one side or the other, when you talk about anti-Muslim bigotry, you're often quick to be accused of defending terror, which makes no sense. And at the same time, when you critique specific practices or ideas of Islam, you're criticized as being Islamophobic. Talk to me about finding balance, sort of, in this discussion.
Well, that's the million-dollar question as a former Muslim who's not, anti-Muslim necessarily. It's something I struggle with all the time because sometimes my words are used to prop up bigotry of the kind that I don't want to be associated with. People will point to me and say, see, look at what happened to Heina. Clearly, Islam is this horrible thing and every Muslim is a monster, without any sort of nuance or understanding. And then on the other hand, it's true, just by saying I'm an ex-Muslim, I've had people tell me that I'm Islamophobic and promoting hatred and bigotry. So it is a tough place to be in. But I think there is room for those nuanced conversations as long as we acknowledge that this is sort of the hard place that we're in. And one thing to keep in mind too is that as far as the difference between criticizing Islam and, being racist and being sort of a bigot, it has to do with what you're criticizing, how you're criticizing it, and when you're taking the opportunity to do so. Because if the only time you criticize a religion is when Islam is brought up, then maybe that's an issue that you're having with with a particular religion instead of all harms being done by any religion. And then, on the other hand, playing the not all Muslim game is I think where the extremism comes in. Because if your only response to, there is violence perpetuated in the name of Islam around the world is, oh, well, not all Muslims do that. That's not a good answer. That's completely meaningless. Okay, we know not all Muslims do it, but what do we do about the Muslims who are? And the same thing can be flipped, where, if someone talks about some good a Muslim has done and your only response is, well, some Muslims do bad, then, it's a ridiculous game there. It's painting everyone with one brush one way or the other. And it's important to be able to look honestly and with nuance at all that's going on. And part of the problem too is that when we discuss Islam and Muslims, we speak of them as if they were a monolithic entity, as if all Muslims believed anything similar, or all versions of Islam are the same. And so when I get asked questions like, what would you do about terrorism? My question is always, what terrorism, where, what era? It varies so much from area to area, from region to region, from decade to decade. It's important that we be specific in what we're talking about as well.
What was your family's reaction when you left Islam?
Not very positive.
Huh.
As is the case with many insular religions, where religion is a part of your life and your lifestyle and differentiates you from the mainstream and is an identity for you. When somebody rejects that, it feels like they're rejecting you. And I feel like there are similar stories coming out of Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormonism and things like that, where, when a child leaves the faith or anybody leaves the faith, the community feels, like they've been betrayed in some sort of way. And that definitely was true for me. And it was a real struggle, but we're doing okay now. But it took, years and years of patience and forgiveness to really get to where I am now with my family.
What's the situation sort of around holy days and celebrations? I mean, do you participate in the way that makes sense to you? Are you no longer part of those events, or how does that work logistically?
Well, I mean, for a lot of people in my family, they're not very hardcore Muslims. There's a lot of people in my family who don't practice Islam very much, and yet they still go to the celebrations. And so I consider myself in their number. I don't care too much for the religious aspects of it, but there's usually the religious aspects and the more social aspects are fairly differentiated. So it's pretty easy to just go in and participate. I mean, we've invited non-Muslim neighbors to our family's celebrations before without a problem, because it's not all religious. The one thing I don't do at all anymore is Ramadan, but Ramadan is not a party. It's not a festival. It's a time of fasting and penitence, and that's no longer applies to me.
We've been speaking with Heina Dadabhoy, former Muslim, current atheist, who writes about Islam, gender, sexuality, and politics. Thanks so much for sharing your story today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.